Let's go. Welcome to women who fight how female fighters take full agency over their training. Our goal is to celebrate and inspire others with the incredible action women and allies are taking to level the playing field. We talk to experts, uncover prejudice, and champion what's driving our progress.
And today we have Nicole Strock returning to us. We're very lucky. And we're going to talk about a specific paper. So Nicole is going to break down a paper. The title of the paper is Eating Attitudes, Body Esteem, Perfectionism and Anxiety of Judo Athletes and Non-Athletes. So hello, Nicole, and thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me back.
Woo!
So I'm so glad that you guys let me kind of fly with this idea. So the idea of this small podcast episode is to try and help with disseminating scientific information. So a lot of scientists write their manuscripts that they get published in journals, but then they stop there. So they just expect that everyone will know the jargon and understand what the heck they had done their research on. But it doesn't stop there. So my intent here is to try and help simplify and explain what's going on in this specific paper. And we chose one that was relevant towards judo athletes. So in research groups, we typically do something called, or a lot of groups do this, journal club. So we meet, we have a paper that gets sent out, everyone comes together and discusses the paper. So this is kind of like a little mini journal club where I'll be kind of walking you through this paper. So we'll see how it goes.
Love that.
Okay, so Marina introduced the title of the paper. The authors of this paper are from France. So the subjects, the participants in this paper are French judo athletes. And the whole reason for doing this paper is to start exploring how disordered eating, mood, anxiety are presenting in judo athletes. It's fairly common in an athletic population to present with disordered eating types of symptoms. So there is a difference between disordered eating and eating disorder. So an eating disorder is a clinically diagnosed condition, diagnosed by a psychologist. However, you can present with disordered eating behaviors. So basically maladaptive behaviors where you're restricting food intake or you're scared of becoming fat or these types of things that influence how you're consuming food. And these don't have to be, some aren't as severe as what is present in a clinical eating disorder population. So these authors wanted to look at the prevalence of disordered eating behaviors in their athletes, along with symptoms of anxiety and mood disturbances, body satisfaction, and such. Also, they were looking at both male and female athletes, which is interesting because we see a lot of papers, particularly in our field, that look solely at male athletes or solely at female athletes. So it's nice to see a side-by-side comparison of male and female. And additionally, the psychological characteristics that can be related to disordered eating, such as perfectionism, low self-esteem, body dissatisfaction, and mood disturbances are really important to start looking at and trying to see how everything relates. This is an older paper. It was in 2007, but one of the overall issues here is that there's not a lot of research in female weight class sports. So I wanted to find one that was relevant to your audience and would be interesting, but this one just happens to be a little bit older. It doesn't mean that it's not informative. So, so again, limited research means that we don't have a lot of information, but it's our hope that what little information we have, we can still find some little nuggets of knowledge that can carry forward. So the study was conducted to determine whether judo athletes are at higher risk for eating disordered eating symptoms compared to non-athletes. They also wanted to look at how the relationship between eating attitudes, perfectionism, self-esteem, and mood related, particularly in these athletes. And then a final aim of this paper was to determine the prevalence of disordered eating, menstrual dysfunction, and musculoskeletal injuries in these female-specific judo athletes. Okay, so getting into the meat of the paper, who were the participants that were involved in this study? So there were 24 judo athletes, 12 male, 12 female. Typically, they were training about 5 hours a week, 5 times a week between 10 and 12 hours. So these are active individuals. And in terms of technical level, said that they were between first and second Dan black belt. And maybe you guys can comment on that because this is well over my head. It seems like they are very competent athletes.
Yeah, I'd say so.
Okay. So I will say that with one thing that we look at in science is there are several ways that you can judge and interpret a paper. And one of them is looking at how large the sample size is. So this is not a very large sample size. It's 24 athletes. And what you'll see is we also have some control non-athletes as well. But in terms of looking at what their goals of the paper were, and the number of people in the paper, we have to kind of take the results with a grain of salt. 24 is not a lot. And specifically, one of their aims is to look at just female athletes. So that's just 12 people. So you'll see like the percentages are at first look a little alarming, but then you have to kind of take a step back and be like, oh, well, this is only 12 athletes. Still informative, but we just have to take the information with a grain of salt. So we have judo athletes, 24 of them, and then we also have 31. They describe them as sedentary people, but I wouldn't necessarily describe them as sedentary. They still had some sort of training, but it was no more than 3 hours a week. Later, they changed the terminology to controls, which I think is more appropriate. So non-athletic control. So what was actually measured in this paper? They were doing mainly questionnaires. So questionnaires are subjective in nature. So this means that it's based on people's perceptions and their judgment. Typically in a research setting, we get a variety of different types of methods to collect information. Subjective is easier because you can give questionnaires, ask people's opinions, but it's also influenced by their personal experience. And so to me, subjective data is a little wishy-washy in terms of being able to interpret, but we're dealing specifically with psychological questionnaires, and that's how we look at psychology. So they did a lot of questionnaires first to get medical history, health history, some training, injury-related information, and then they looked at some validated questionnaires. So there are certain types of questionnaires that are specifically designed and studied and crafted in order to look at certain constructs that are based on different psychological parameters. So there were several different validated questionnaires that they used. One was dealing with eating attitudes and looking at, how people were more prone to having disordered eating symptoms. This is not a diagnosis for eating disorders. So I just want to make that clear. In order to be diagnosed, you have to be diagnosed by a psychologist. So these are just questionnaires that are administered. They fill in a bubble answer, whatnot. So the higher the score that's on this eating attitudes test, that means that higher risk of having more disordered eating characteristics. Do you have a question?
So the questions were questions that would lead to the assumption that they would have disordered eating.
Yes.
It wouldn't be something like, Do you feel that you have disordered eating patterns?
It wouldn't outright say that.
All right.
No,
Okay.
no,
Okay.
no. There would be questions that would get at different, like, are you restricting food? Do you feel consciously that you are limiting certain food groups? These kinds of things.
But then one more thing. Sorry. Did they know what they were there for? What the study was?
Yes, yes. So in all research that gets published, you have to, in order to collect data from a research participant, you have to very clearly outline what the goals of the study are, what will be happening. So the research participant, if you've done the informed consent correctly, should know exactly what the research is about. So it's not like you're getting asked out of the blue. So they should know.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So other questionnaires, they were looking at perfectionism, self-esteem, and mood. So dealing with tension, anxiety, depression, that kinds of stuff. But there was other important information that was collected. Weight restriction methods, which are fairly common in weight class sports. Whether or not the female athletes were using oral contraceptives, and we know that people use a lot of hormonal contraceptives now. I think it's something like, I've seen statistics like upwards of 60% of people are on some sort of hormonal contraceptive. So that adds a little layer of complication when we're talking about menstrual disturbances, right? Menstrual history, so self-reported amounts of times that they've had a menstrual cycle over the past year. And they were able to characterize the women specifically on whether or not they were regularly menstruating, so having a normal, regular cycle, whether they were amenorrheic, so not having a menstrual cycle for 3 months or longer, or oligomenorrheic, which means that there's long and irregular cycles. So the oligo and amenorrheic women were classified as having menstrual irregularities, which we'll use that terminology for discussing some of the results. So self-report is not the best way to look at menstrual cycle related information, but it is certainly convenient. I would like to see some sort of hormonal analysis to really confirm cycle status, but that is expensive, time consuming, and a lot of people don't have those resources to be able to conduct that. So we can get self-report, which I think this entire study is based on self-report. Again, still informative, but you have to kind of think about these types of methods in the background and when we're interpreting the data. Okay, so getting to the good stuff. What did these researchers actually find? What I found was super interesting is that they found that 70% of the athletes had lost about 2.8 kilograms during the season. That's about 6.2 pounds. I think that's pretty significant over the course of a season. And looking back at the BMIs, the athletes are within the healthy range. So if you're within the healthy range, losing 6 pounds or almost 3 kgs, that's, I think, a pretty significant weight loss. It should be noted that the controls, the non-exercising controls, lost about 1.2 kilograms. It says that they lost this weight sometimes by exercising a little more. So these were not athletes, they were still exercising a little bit, but I don't know if this was necessarily the best quote unquote control group to have, because you'll see there are some interesting results with the controls. In terms of some of the disordered eating and weight control methods, 60% of the athletes, both male and female, were consciously limiting food choices, which I think is a lot. Yeah.
Was this paper around competition time?
It was over the course of the season. So like they did one instance where they did all of these questionnaires, but it was related to what had happened in the previous season.
All right.
Yeah. So there was an element of them having participated in competitions prior to being assessed. In terms of weight loss methods, it seemed like a majority, about 62%, increased their exercise, 55% restricted fluid, and about 12.5 restricted food intake. So I think these are fairly common methods in terms of dealing with weight class athletes to make weight for their competition. There were some people that used diet pills, vomiting, and diuretics as well. So we do have the more extreme methods of weight control, which is concerning. But again, 20% of 24 people is not entirely a lot, but it's still, I think, concerning. One thing that I found interesting is that they looked to see who was promoting these weight loss ideas. And I think that's really important. I assumed going into it, I'm not in this weight class sport space. I assumed that the coaches had a lot of say in promoting weight loss and making sure that their athletes were ready for a competition. But surprisingly, only about 8% of people reported that the coaches, they were getting their information about weight loss from coaches. And I think that this is much lower than what has been reported elsewhere. Somewhere I've seen it's a higher, like 40% of people see the coaches promoting weight loss, which I think can be a pretty detrimental, can lead to some not great scenarios. What I found interesting is that about a fourth of the people said that they got their weight loss information from former athletes or teammates. So that kind of goes into the relationships that you have with other athletes around you. And if you see someone doing something that then maybe you think that, oh, they're performing well, then I need to act like they are. So I think that's interesting. And about a fourth really did the weight loss and weight restriction methods on their own. It was self-directed. Okay, questions about that?
I'm just trying to absorb all of this. My mind.
Yeah. Am I going too fast?
No. You made me think of something though, which was how if you are an athlete competing in a weight class sport like, I don't know, MMA or judo or something, if you're going from if you're in that from a child, then as you grow you change weight classes. And sometimes it's like that means your game has to change as well. And I think there's like, we've definitely spoken to people about how, you know, you get to a point where, like, you know, you're 18 and you're still trying to fight in the sort of the weight that you were when you were like 15, because that's your game. And then you actually get stuck in this sort of cycle of like, you don't want to go up a weight because actually your game is down here, and it would take a while, you know. So it's actually it's such a strategic thing as well, which then has knock-on effects to your health and other things.
Absolutely. I mean, we forget that we go through puberty for a reason, right? Body changes.
Yeah.
And so, again, I'm not in this space, so I can't really comment on, you know, the athletic side of it. But yes, that is a complicating factor where you are good at a certain weight, but then you experience growth because you are a normal human.
Growing.
Yes, progressing with your life. So it is a layer of complication.
Yeah.
Okay, so getting into the stuff that I like, which is bone injuries and menstrual cycle characteristics. I found this to be very interesting, specifically regarding the reported bone injuries. So they got this from a questionnaire, asked them over the course of their career, have they had bone injuries? And interestingly, the women, about a fourth of the women said that they had a bony injury in the past. Men were about a third, so a little bit more. The most interesting was that the controls had the highest prevalence of reported bone injuries. It was 35%. And that to me seemed pretty high for a control. But if you start looking into the diet history, which they did start delving into that in some of the results in the discussion of the paper, it seemed like a lot of these control participants were attempting to lose weight at some period of time. And so actively losing weight and not doing it with the guidance of a registered dietitian, or maybe you're not intending to do self-harm, but you are, that can lead to a whole bunch of hormonal issues that can impact menstrual cycle status and ultimately impact bone health. So I found that to be very interesting, that the controls of this study actually had the highest prevalence.
That's crazy.
It is, but I also think that it kind of, it lets us know that these types of combat sports where you are physically hitting each other and doing certain moves that involve different muscle groups and activation, and it influences the bone. So it's almost protective for bone, even though, you know, we see these weight restriction habits, and what you'll see is that the menstrual cycle characteristics to me were a little alarming. So in terms of oral contraceptive use for the female athletes specifically, 16% were using oral contraceptives. So they just kind of took those people out of the remaining menstrual cycle characteristics analysis. So of the people that were not on oral contraceptives, 58% of the females had reported some sort of menstrual dysfunction. That is high. That is a lot. Again, 12 athletes, so it's, you know, it's not a large group, but half of those women, more than half of those women had menstrual cycle dysfunction, compared to the controls where it was only 7%.
Wow.
Yes.
Even though, because you'd think with the bone thing, like the menstrual dysfunction, I would assume would be energy deficit, not eating enough for the exercise that you're doing.
That's what I would assume as well. Yeah.
But then that doesn't chime with the fact that that would also impact your, you know, your bone density. And that's really, I can't wrap my head around that.
Yeah. So that's why I think that these types of sports where we are striking with the hands and the feet, it acts as almost a positive stimulus for the bone. So it is protective.
It needs to be stronger, so it is stronger.
Yeah. So that I found to be just fascinating, that the high prevalence within these judo athletes, because it is pretty consistent with other populations of athletes that we have seen. Our lab specifically studies menstrual cycle dysfunction, so we're pretty familiar with the prevalence of amenorrhea and oligomenorrhea. So this is fairly consistent, but again, small group of people that this paper is looking at, still alarming in my opinion. Now, looking at the women that were self-reported as amenorrheic, every single one of them were deemed high risk for eating disorders symptomology based on the specific questionnaire. So that I think is another huge red flag right there. The link between disordered eating symptoms and the severity and menstrual cycle dysfunction. Okay, so now moving into one of the main goals of the paper was looking at different eating behavior characteristics and other mood and psychological characteristics in these athletes. What they found is that a fourth of the women were characterized as at risk based on the eating disorder questionnaire, whereas 0% of the males were considered at risk. And I find that to be fascinating. So yes, typically women, female athletes present with a higher prevalence of disordered eating behaviors, but men also suffer from disordered eating behaviors and eating disorders. So this does seem to me a little like, were they answering the questions like they needed to, the male athletes? I don't know. But I found that to be very interesting. Also, what we found, or what the authors found, is that there was a higher bulimia score in this eating disorder questionnaire. So more women were presenting with these restricting, purging behaviors compared to the male athletes, and also compared to the controls. And this seems to be in line with a lot of research in athletes. And then when looking at perfectionism, in populations that I'm more familiar with, which are more endurance sport athletes, perfectionism seems to play a an interesting role in terms of types of psychological characteristics that could contribute to restrictive eating behaviors. There was no difference in these athletes for male and females in terms of perfectionism. So I found that to be very interesting, that perfectionism didn't seem to influence or have a big role in these judo athletes. However, it seems like weight satisfaction was a concern and actually contributed to lower body self-esteem, appearance, and was a big contributor to the overall eating disorder risk score. So that is what this paper found. So giving us some information, again, some takeaways, small sample size, so not very large. We have to take the findings with a grain of salt. This was based on self-report. So again, we have to realize that specifically for psychological characteristics, right? How do we assess psychological characteristics? Through a questionnaire. But we just have to take everything and keep that in the back of our head when we're looking at the data. There, to me, in my opinion, were some concerning weight loss and weight loss methods and risk for disordered eating disorder, particularly in the female athletes. And I think the biggest thing that was a red flag for me was the prevalence of menstrual cycle disturbances in these female athletes. So again, not a lot of research in this area, but I think that this paper is interesting and hopefully I've explained it in a way that your listeners can understand.
I think
how did you guys feel about the paper?
I was thinking though, it's like I was thinking about the menstrual cycle disturbances, and I mean, I feel like it's so kind of culturally accepted that that's actually an okay thing because, oh, you don't have to deal with your period. That's actually really great. So dealing with that as like seeing that as a health concern maybe also contributes to the women kind of accepting that that's kind of okay. So then when it happens, it's like, oh well, it's not a problem. And so I feel like, and that is changing. It's definitely changing. But I feel like I wonder if that contributed to that happening because it wasn't actually seen as a negative outcome.
I think that's a really valid assessment.
One thing that is interesting to me is a 0% like eating disorder for males, and it got me thinking if we have a male athlete knowing that they enter this study for eating disorders, maybe, I mean, that's what I think, but could there be a pressure not to answer in a way that is going to lead to them having a, being seen having an eating disorder? Because there's the social pressure as well.
I agree. And so I don't use the eating disorder questionnaire that was specifically used in this paper, but we do, my lab uses a different questionnaire. And there is a way to check and see if people have falsified their results.
How?
There's certain patterns that show up in the data. And so based on how they have answered certain questions, we can say that this is a fake profile. And so, yeah. So, and I'm not as familiar with this specific examination, but for us, at least, the eating disorder inventory, which I use in my lab, we can see if there's a fake profile.
Wow, that's so clever.
Yeah.
I can't really get my head around how you do that, but it's amazing.
Yeah.
It would be very, very interesting to see how these results will be different in MMA, because we know that athletes lose way more.
And they're buoying all the time.
Yes.
Fights.
Especially with women. I'm so curious to see how's their menstrual cycle, because there are such big fluctuations in their weight so very often. So
And also, aside from that, I mean, I think physically, what are they wearing while they're doing their competitions as well? So correct me if I'm wrong, judo athletes are wearing some
they wear a
kimono. Yes, kimono.
kimono.
Yeah.
Whereas MMA athletes are basically in bra and shorts.
Yeah.
And so I wonder also if they're being self-conscious about your physical appearance on top of you're trying to fit into the weight class for competitive reasons.
And
I don't know.
And also, they have to weigh one day before their fight. And then whatever they've lost, they try to regain in just one day. So there must be a significant difference in their performance. That must be researched, and to see, is that worth it? Is this whole thing worth it?
I mean, there was this other thing though. It's like there actually aren't. I've listened to, I think Joe Rogan is an advocate for, he's a UFC commentator, and he is an advocate for getting more weight classes, because there just aren't enough for both men and women. Like there's not enough, and it's like actually like I think there's 10 pounds in between each weight class. So either, which is big, and so you want to be the heaviest in your weight class. And the likelihood that is actually where you sit, or like even if you do sit it, you might want to drop. It's all ridiculous. It's like cheating, but it's kind of allowed. But it's actually doesn't do anyone any good. It's just
because no one walks in that way.
No, and if no one cut weight, they'd probably still fight the same people. Do you know what I mean?
That's true. Yeah. Without going through all these like yo-yo weight periods. Oh yeah. I think that we're starting to see a little bit of more research coming out in the weight cycling and weight class sports, but still lacking in females. So I'm hoping that within the next several years we'll really start to see that.
Are there more studies around women going on to do with this sort of thing?
I feel like it's not as prevalent as it should be. I mean, when we were looking through, and I'm probably not the best to comment on it, but when we were looking through, there really was only a handful in female athletes. I don't know what is currently being done that still needs to get published, and maybe there's a lot in the pipeline. But we need a lot of information. We need a lot more studies that are looking at various different types of weight class sports, because they're not the same.
No, absolutely. I'd love to know as well. I remember talking to an athlete a while ago how the dieting had basically screwed up her digestive system. And it's like it'd be very interesting to see the impact on your system, that sort of on men and women, the weight, how that cut so regularly, and how consistently, or either consistently underfueling or underfueling at intervals, what impact that has on your body and the way, because I think she cut weight, she water loaded once, and then afterwards and she lost the weight really fine, but then afterwards it never worked again. Her body had just been like, no,
not gonna do it.
Not happening.
Yeah, it's fascinating. The body is truly amazing. And we really push it to its limits, I think.
Perfect.
Okay, well, I hope you liked this.
We loved it. We loved it. We want another one.
I love talking to you, Nicole. You make things clear.
So clear. And you make them more interesting.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I am trying. Trying to communicate science is something I'm actively working on. So
well, you don't have to work a lot. You're there.
I mean, the one thing I find interesting though is because you picked out some points where you were like, that's interesting and that doesn't sound right, and so I'm going, oh, that's why you'd need to do another study. I see why. And I'm always just like, oh yeah, it kind of makes sense that you'd need to confirm results. You need to make sure they're not incorrect. But actually there are discrepancies, and I can imagine that would come up a lot. And so constantly going over them and
which is why it's good to take an eagle eye view of the research and see what else has been done and are these results consistent with what other researchers are doing, to really show if there are big patterns or really concerning information that is being reported. That's why like meta-analyses and systematic reviews, which are a way of condensing research from a very specific research question, it allows you to really get the best idea of what's going on. So it's hard when you are only taking one paper at a time, because you know it gets published and it still gives us important information, but it is in a very small, limited, like this was just French judo athletes, right? Are there other differences in American judo athletes, in, you know, athletes from different countries? I don't know, because we don't have a lot of research to tell us that. So yeah, that I think it's all very interesting, and I hope I was able to give a little bit of insight to kind of clarify and break it down so that it's not all just a bunch of jargon.
No, it's marvelous. Thank you so much. We'll
Thank
do
you
it
for
again
having
soon.
me.
We'll definitely do it again.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nicole.